Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Tuesday. It's time once again to discuss some pagan problems, and this week we're going to talk about spiritual isolation, because it isn't easy being the lone pagan in a non-pagan community. And it also isn't easy to be a pagan in a group of pagans and think, I don't have anything in common with these people. And it can be hard. You can feel extremely isolated even as you are trying to connect, and it might lead some people to decide, well, maybe I'm not going to try to connect after all. Now, on top of this, some people by nature are extremely introverted, and they may never have been taught how to set that introversion aside long enough or to be open for long enough to get acquainted with the like-minded, so they have some connections and they do have some support. Now, other people have had very frustrating experiences with other pagans, either online or in face-to-face settings, and they ended up washing their hands of the idea of trying to be a part of a community because sometimes people are terrible. And I wish I could say that by becoming pagan that everyone you meet is going to be nice and lovely and you're just going to be the best of buds, but I think we're all old enough and mature enough to understand that is not a reality of human existence. And that brings me to the next thing that some people worry about, which is namely rejection. You might think, I get enough rejection on spiritual issues from non-pagans, and then you become very hesitant to risk happening it within pagan community, because that's probably going to hurt worse. What if you feel rejected by someone who, you respected? It's not a fun thing. And I can certainly see how people who, whether it's by their natural disposition or as the result of previous bad experiences, just like, I don't know, maybe I'm better off completely by myself. Another thing that works against us is really the anti-organization sentiment that's been prevalent within paganism for as long as I've been a part of it, which is the viewpoint that it's better not to have groups for fear that modern paganism finds itself experiencing similar issues and challenges that the churches experience. And I don't want to dismiss that concern, and I certainly don't deny that there is some legitimacy to that concern. I don't want to fall prey to the delusion that, awful things like that could never happen within pagan groups. We're all just human, and human beings invariably create problems amongst themselves of various degrees of severity, and in every sphere of life. This risk of gathering together with people and then having problems, it isn't restricted just to spiritual settings, although, admittedly, it probably hurts a bit more when it is happening within a spiritual circle. But the reality that I think we should come to terms with is that pagan cultures in the past had temples. They had stone circles, they had sacred groves, they had a variety of other holy sites, and these are places where people would gather together as a community for worship. And part of the pagan revival, which is ongoing, does ultimately involve coming together for group worship, and hopefully being able to build physical structures where our community can have set spots to gather together, for the sake of convenience, if nothing else, and to not always having to be trying to find places that can be rented out or anything else. And there are certain groups that are making an effort towards this. I forget what he's calling it. I think it's Northern Traditions, something. I think that's one of the names, but it's the group that Jacob on the Wisdom of Odin channel, he's been talking about. They're trying to get money together to purchase land, to build a building. That way, when they have their gatherings, there's a place that, is owned by the organization to where their people can come and gather together, enjoy some fellowship, and engage in traditions, worship the gods. I mean, this is a wonderful, positive step, and it's something that, our community as a whole, whether we're associated with his group or whether we're doing our own thing, we need to start trying to do of how can we connect with others and come together and share the joy of our spirituality with the like-minded. Another challenge we face is the never-ending fracturing of paganism and just fracturing into absolute oblivion. What I've observed is that, at least in the United States, there seems to be a race amongst some pagans to try to make themselves as different from all other pagans as what is humanly possible, and passing this off of, see how enlightened and spiritually mature and better off I am. Here's what the actual result of that is that what probably began as a pursuit for a particular individual to find where they really belong within the pagan family tree, and it gets twisted into something else. It becomes this chasm that's separating people to the point where pagans have less and less and less in common with each other. And where's the spiritual benefit? I have not seen one single shred of a spiritual benefit to show for this process. And this has led me to believe that this isn't actually exploration, it's just a sign of someone being lost. Maybe they belong within paganism, maybe some other path is where they truly belong, but they don't know, which is why they're in this constant chaotic permutation. But this isn't the chaos of creation, it's the chaos of self-destruction. Maybe they have an exaggerated need to feel special. Maybe it's not enough to be part of a minority religion. They need a little something extra so they can say, look how special and exceptional I am. And they don't know how to fill that hole that's within their soul. And it creates more loneliness, and it makes it harder and harder to form a community. So I think we've got a pretty good diagnosis of various things that are contributing to individuals having a sense of spiritual isolation and certainly community-wide challenges that we're facing. But now let's talk a little bit about possible remedies. And so all this, I hope this is the beginning of a conversation. I'm not presenting this as the ultimate answer, but simply we need to start moving in the direction of an answer. So one thing that I think that would really help is to affirm and prioritize spirituality over the issues that we're confronting during the day. This means that we need to have a sense that our spirituality, our beliefs, the divine is more important than what's going on politically. There's a reason why I only make one video a week that overtly comments on current events, and why in other videos, if I'm making any kind of reference to current events at all, it's confined to the way it can affect our spirituality and hopefully how we can overcome it if it's a non-helpful, detrimental influence. And honestly, if it wasn't for the fact that leftist politics was so prevalent amongst many people who claim the name pagan, and if it wasn't for the fact that this has given a very false impression of our community to the broader non-pagan community as a whole, I wouldn't feel the need to comment on current events on this channel. I would probably have a separate channel where I could rant and rave about whatever was bothering me in society. And also, if we were not in such a pretty pass when it comes to what's going on in our civilization, if it wasn't so serious, I would probably just not talk about it here. But leftism is a cancer within paganism. It's a cancer within our civilization and every institution that comes into contact with it. I think we have plenty of evidence to show what it does to people and what it does to organizations and how awful the consequences are. And ignoring that won't go away. It won't make it disappear. So things have to be said, if for no other reason than to let other people know that not all pagans actually hate the Western world. Most of us are pretty consciously aware that we are the roots. Our gods are the actual roots of the Western world. And so we're not exactly interested in destroying that. Improving? Yes. Reforming where appropriate? Absolutely. Destroying and saying it was all horrible to begin with? No, not so much. So all this being said, there is a need to remember that religion and spirituality is about more than the struggles we are facing in the present day. It's about the search for eternal truths, trying to figure out how the universe works. What is the meaning of life? How can we commune with the gods? How can we benefit from that relationship? How can we become good human beings? How can we teach our children how to be good human beings? How can we have good communities? So we probably need to start re-embracing the things that brought us to paganism to begin with, and then to emphasize amongst ourselves the areas over which we have broad agreement. And this is in order to avoid being consumed by all the madness that's going on. We need to make our communities strongholds and oases where people can come together over the search of the divine and to know that it's more important than tribal politics. Another thing we will probably need to do is confront any baggage we might be personally carrying from previous bad experiences with groups, whether these groups were religious or other kinds of groups. Now, after getting hurt, the temptation is always to close yourself off so you never go through that again, and then to actively choose to be deaf to any line of reasoning that points out the downsides of that decision, including the fact that avoiding pain is not the same thing as healing, and it's not the same thing as actually learning. Now, I'm not saying that we need to throw wisdom and experience out the window, but I do think we could agree that we probably shouldn't be prejudging scenarios and people and assume that it's all going to go badly just because something in our past went badly before, especially if there's evidence that a good outcome is possible And this especially holds true if you're dealing with different people, people who have never had a detrimental effect on you. We shouldn't treat them the same as we would treat someone who actually has a history of harming us. Now, it's one thing for us to walk alone spiritually when there's no choice, and quite another to actively pursue that outcome and pretend like it's a virtue when there's actually no real need and actually quite a few arguments against doing so. So I wonder, at times, how much of that is less about being, an independent person and you're forging your own spiritual path and look at you go, and could it possibly be about that fear of rejection that we talked about a little bit ago? Now, I say this as someone who promotes the idea that individuals should be so grounded in their spirituality that they would be willing and able to practice that spirituality even if they were the only person on earth to do so. I think that's fine, but that doesn't mean that the goal is to be the only person on earth who's practicing your spirituality. And that's not the situation that we're in. Now, depending on where we live, fellow pagans may be few and far between, but they do exist, and there could be benefits from seeking them out. If nothing else, sometimes it's just nice to talk to someone who has a similar spiritual worldview, and a great deal can be learned from having another practitioner to consult with. So what we can do is support efforts of people who are actively trying to form community, both for the sake of having mutual support and to improve the odds of paganism surviving. Now, you might say, well, Brigantia, paganism is one of the fastest growing religions right now. What are you talking about? Survival. I'm like, well, we have a lot of people calling themselves pagan, but how many of them are actually acquainted with pagan ideas? How many of them have read the myths, who could tell you anything about the gods? How many of them could define any aspect of their spirituality or what actually makes them pagan as opposed to something else? Just saying that you're pagan is not the same thing as having a solid theological foundation. Just saying. So when it comes to community, obviously face-to-face interaction is always going to be better than, conversing over the internet. But the internet is the means through which we communicate, and we've got to start somewhere and build up from there. And there are plenty of groups on the internet, everywhere, on all platforms, and I've been a part of quite a few over the years. And it seems to be feast or famine with most of these groups. Either they're so large and so active that there's no meaningful interaction between group members, or it's so tiny and so quiet that you can hear the crickets. And there might be just a couple of people, and it's always the same people, sharing things, introducing topics of conversation, making an effort to get acquainted, and they're usually met with those same crickets because so many people prefer to be a wallflower than they prefer to be an actual member and participant in a group. And either scenario can be discouraging because neither scenario is actually going to provide us with company. And having some company is half the point. Another limitation of that is that if we find ourselves needing help, advice, or just needing to bounce ideas around, it can be really hard to get someone to participate and have that exchange of ideas. Now, all this being admitted, I do think that it's good for people to persevere and keep trying to get connected and to use the internet as a tool for doing that. It can lay the groundwork for better things. Small seeds do grow into mighty oaks, but if we're persistent and if we make the effort to interact when we can. And community is always going to involve give and take, so we can't just be givers and we can't just be takers. And given the breakdown of society, relearning a healthy equilibrium is going to take time. So we might as well start now. Avoid the rush. We can get going. So in a pagan group, whether it's online or face-to-face, you can't always be the talker and you can't always be the listener because that is not a workable dynamic and people will not get comfortable with each other that way. And also the conversation can't always be serious and it can't always be light. There needs to be a mixture of both, and people within the group will need to be able and be willing to adapt to the moment and allow conversations to evolve organically. And we also shouldn't expect someone else to always be the one taking the lead. A little bit of initiative can actually go a really long way. And for the people who have started up groups, when they see someone else, becoming more invested in it, not only does that help renew them so they can keep going, it also it can be very encouraging to them. Like, oh, okay, I wasn't crazy. I'm not the only person who thinks X, Y, or Z matters. Here's another example. Yay, I'm not by myself. It can help. It helps more than you know. Now, one of the strongest arguments for making efforts towards creating a thriving pagan community is that it will enable the continuation of paganism. Because if this spiritual fracturing continues, that will lead to a disintegration of pagan concepts. They're already pretty watered down in a lot of circles, and we see the results of that. And if we allow this to go on, our form of spirituality will just fade into the abyss, into oblivion, and it will be our fault. We have a responsibility to pass on what we've learned. And now the obvious example is that parents obviously have the obligation to help create a community in which their children can thrive. And, in order to have that community, that means we need to find some common ground so that communities can be built. Communities are not built on endless contrast. It has to have common ground. People need to be able to agree on some basic things. And this idea isn't anything new. And the only reason why communities exist at all is because people are able to find enough common ground to be able to stick together and get something out of it. And the only reason why anything in human experience passes down from one generation to the next is because it's understood that the next generation needs to be taught. Knowledge is not automatic. So if something is important, then the next generation needs to be informed, whether it's your own children or if it's about, teaching something to someone who's new to paganism. And right now, it's our turn. It's our time to continue to learn, our time to teach, our time to find the like-minded and to make those connections. And the pagans who came out of the broom closet in the mid-20th century, they worked hard to resurrect ancient ideas, ancient traditions, and to attempt to create modern forms of worship. They had fewer resources and far less information than we do. They didn't let that stop them. They made do with what they had, and they remained open to what they might learn in the future. And it's up to us to continue the work they began. And it is definitely our job to teach those who come after us why it's worthwhile to keep paganism alive. And it's all going into making that community. So we'll be able to go on into the future. So let me know what you think. I would love to hear from you, whether at Blackbird's Brew on Discord, there's a link to join in the description box below, or by leaving a comment on this channel. If you haven't done so already, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.